Welcome back to the Sunday Scrum on CBC News Network. Today, International Women's Day. It's celebrated every year on March 8th. This year's theme is Each for Equal. The message is simple. Each and every one of us can choose to challenge stereotypes, fight bias, and to celebrate women's achievements. But is it reflected in politics in this country and beyond? Susan, John, Vicky, and Tasha are here for the final round. Worth noting, 25 years ago, the United Nations in Beijing pledged to work for the equality of women. And of course, 70% of the positions in political power and in business around the world still occupied by men. So, Tasha, do you want to start us off about the state of women in politics in 2020?
Becoming candidates. We know there are lots of significant barriers at that level. A harder time also winning nominations, a harder time winning, and look at Elizabeth Warren. I'm not, a fan of her politics by any stretch, but she didn't even win her own state, far from. The rejection of women in politics, I don't think is uniquely necessarily because of what they stand for, i.e. their positions and their issues. I think there is an element, and polling shows it, that some women are not prepared, some people are not prepared, including some women, to accept a woman as a political leader. And that is extremely unfortunate. But going back to something that was said earlier with regards to the fight for Indigenous rights in Canada, for example, hundreds of years, it takes a long time, longer than it should. But in the case of women also, we've been battling, thousands of years of having men taking more positions of power than women do. So I think that it is a slow process, is backs and forths, and certainly Canada doesn't have a landscape full of female premiers like it did just a few years ago. But I'm not pessimistic in terms of women's participation in the future in politics. I do think it will continue to grow, but we have to keep carving out that place. Simple as that.
Yeah, Tasha, I remember in the media business, I remember the debate over whether one would listen to and believe a woman reading the news. And thank goodness that has changed quite rapidly.
Yeah, because people don't believe anybody reading the news. I found this a profoundly discouraging time, and it may be because I'm older and I've been through this so many times. And just this weekend, for example, the Ontario Liberal Party elected another 46-year-old man, white man. I don't want to disparage him without knowing much about him yet, Mr. Del Duca, but there was also in the race a very promising, vigorous 35-year-old woman who came third. But I mean, it seems like women are always having to be satisfied with coming third, maybe the next generation. We're always dumping it on the next generation. I thought Elizabeth Warren was easily more qualified than either of the, doddering septuagenarians that we're stuck with. I can't believe that the contest for the Democratic nomination is between two white men who are 77 and 78. I'm old too. I'm not being ageist. I just think there has to be a limit, There's only, as Tasha also referenced, there's only one woman leader among the premiers and territorial leaders. I bet you nobody can name it. It's Carolyn Cochrane from the New York Northwest Territories. It's not at all encouraging.
And of course, there was a time when 6 of 13 premier
That's
positions
right.
across this country were held by women. John, your take on the current state?
Well, we do need more women politicians. I wrote about this in an essay last month. Long-term care costs are going to triple over the course of the next 3 decades in Canada. They're going to go from $20 billion to $70 billion. 20% of your income tax is going to go to long-term care. At 75% of all long-term care is provided for free by family members, overwhelmingly by women. So we need women in positions of power to ensure that government resources are sent where they need to be sent in order to care for people as they age, rather than boys playing with their toys. But I'm ultimately optimistic about this for demographic reasons. As some of the viewers know, Daryl Brick and I wrote a book on the demography of fertility. Fertility rates continue to come down around the world. They're coming down in Canada among Indigenous women who are now at replacement rate across the country, a very little known statistic. When you see fertility rates coming down, especially towards replacement rate, that means women are becoming empowered, they're getting education, they're making decisions for themselves. And when women are able to make decisions and take control over their own lives, then they invariably choose to have fewer children, whether that applies in Canada or in East Timor. It's a universal phenomenon. So I think in the long term, all the indications are strong and positive that women are acquiring more power, more autonomy, more control over their lives. But it is a very long game, and we seem to be in a rather bad patch here in Canada right now.
Yeah, Vicky, your thoughts?
I don't think it's a coincidence that at one time we had, almost 50% of women premiers, and we're now met and faced with a wall of variously
Suits.
fitting blue suits. I think it's not, one of the things that I think is always up for consideration is how it is men and, people who don't identify as women view women as leaders and as political decision makers, aside from the ways in which our political system is structured so that the ways women want to govern don't really work, or don't really work or aren't accounted for. Quebec Solidaire has a two-person leadership system. That, to me, is inherently much more feminist than our standard system of approach. And in a sense, we kind of have the same thing at the federal level with Chrystia Freeland and Justin Trudeau sort of splitting the role, whether or not they're splitting that salary. But I think that's the kind of where we're at. That's the big picture. But I'm not as hopeful as John about it, because I think in so many ways there are indicators that women's empowerment is not necessarily driving women's ability to feed their children, to clothe themselves, to get the kind of success and sustainability that women that 20, 30, 40 years ago doing the same things would have seen. There was a New York Times report that I think almost every woman has seen saying that women's unpaid labor is valued at $10.9 trillion. Someone owes women a large check, and we're not going to get it.
I'm still waiting for mine. I was going to say, though, with respect to John and the point about women directing money where it should go in the case of, needing assistance for care and this kind of thing, there's no evidence, I think, that women, when they become in a position of power, are necessarily going to govern that much different than men on every metric like that. I mean, I think of great women leaders or women who really stand out. Margaret Thatcher, squashed the coal miners' strike, went to war. Indira Gandhi sterilized forcibly part of her population. Women are not necessarily the most compassionate creatures in terms of care. They make tough decisions too when they have to be made, and sometimes they make decisions that we really don't like. The point is that leaders and leadership demands a certain kind of personality, and women or men who go to that have to be pretty resilient and tough people. So I think to expect women to govern differently isn't necessarily fair. I think that every time, every age demands a different type of governance, and politics too, and what you believe in are going to affect that more than your gender. So, don't wait for women to save the world, but give them a place to try and make it better.
I think that's a very good point, Tasha. I think we need to eventually or begin to start looking past the representation of particular genders and talk about what their politics entails. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, that's still fairly unpalatable to a lot of people. A lot of very feminist candidates, I'm thinking of everyone from Kathleen Wynne through to Elizabeth Warren, were met not just with people not being willing to vote for them, but a level of blowback that's fairly vociferous and fairly dangerous and scary. And so, even when we're looking at the politics, I don't know that a feminist politics is necessarily helping women. Yes, Indira Gandhi and Margaret Thatcher did govern, but they governed in a fairly masculinist tradition. And so, whether or not are we going to see any male politicians who are feminists and are willing to govern in the best interests of women and are willing to elevate those concerns to the level of power that they can? I still think that remains to be seen, although I think Justin Trudeau is making a good swing at it.
The
male on the panel remains relentlessly optimistic. And I'll just end with one quick stat, because I think it's one of the most important stats that we never talk about. Since 1990, the number of teenage pregnancies in Canada has declined by 80%. Mm-hmm. That is progress. That is women having access to information, to good sexual education, to contraception. Teenage pregnancies down by 80%. You can't deny that fact, and you can't deny the importance and celebrate the importance of that fact.
One fast, quick final word to you, Susan, please.
Well, let's leave aside. That's totally irrelevant to the discussion we're having, which is about why there aren't more women in power. And I think it's because Vicky touched on it, the masculinist culture. I still think that politics in Canada is really stuck in a very aggressive, very unappealing and unappetizing kind of politics. I think Kathleen Wynne was the victim of it. I think the criticism of her was far harsher and continues to be far harsher than what she deserved. I think it also discourages a lot of men who don't hew to that kind of, kill them dead, win or lose ethic. It's just really, and women keep pushing at the sides and they keep pushing from outside, and good for them.
Susan? I'm sorry. I have to
That's
apologize
okay.
on International Women's Day. I'm going to cut you off. But
That's
thank
okay.
you,
Oops.
everyone, for joining us. Fantastic conversation, as always. And I think of my 17-year-old niece who's making university choices right now and is about to take the world on. Happy Women's Day to her as well. We're going to end the Sunday Scrum for another week. Thanks to our guests, freelance columnist Susan Riley. Thanks, Susan.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, John Ibbotson of the Globe and Mail.
Thank you, John.
Vicky Mochama, Cultural and Society Editor of The Conversation. Thanks, Vicky.
Thanks, John.
And Tasha Keratin, CEO of Ellipsum Public Affairs. Thanks, Tasha.
Thank you.